You find me. Okay, good. Well, Maya, well, first of all, welcome to everybody. We are really happy to have so many participants. And actually, this is a joint venture of the EU mission, the Association of European Integration, and the Israel-EU Chamber of Commerce. And we're very happy to have so many participants. And I think that what we really want to hear is about the EU and what the EU is doing in the crisis. I think that we all actually are looking to Europe and obviously Italy and Spain with a lot of compassion. But I think that it's important for us to understand what is happening in Europe, because there's a lot of mis and disinformation concerning actually the reaction of the EU. A lot of people are, in a way, taking advantage of the crisis to bash the Europeans. And I think that we, as people that knows Europe and are very concerned about what's going in Europe, we have also a task to really inform and know what Europe is doing. For that, we need actually to understand, first of all, that I don't think that a lot of people know, but all the medical area or sanitary area were not in European competence. I mean, the EU is not competent for the health sector in all the 28, 27 countries. So the fact that they don't have the competence does not mean that they're not doing anything. On the contrary, but we have to adjust our expectation. The fact that actually now Europe is getting very much active, and we'll hear about it from the ambassador, which I'm very happy agreed to participate. I see that we have also the commercial attaché of the embassy, Ms. Gotcha, with the Polish name I cannot pronounce, but we probably hear from her later on also. We have also Netta from our mission in Brussels. So I am very happy to have also her on our Zoom meeting, and we'll hear from her also probably from Brussels. But I think that without further ado, what will happen is we'll give to actually to Maya to give us a very short presentation she prepared, and then we'll ask the ambassador to talk, we'll ask the commercial attaché, and then we'll open it for question and answer. The best way of doing that is actually you raise your hand on the right-hand side of your screen, those who want to speak, and then Maya, because we have to thank Maya using the Hebrew University Zoom license, she can open and mute and unmute you. So she will be the master of the ceremony, and she will be the one giving also the permission. So we'll have a round of questions, and then we will have answers from our officials. So thank you very much. And Maya, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Danny, and thank you for joining us. Thank you, Ambassador Giaufret, for raising up to the challenge to speak during this turbulent time about this crisis. And what I want to share with you is some initial thoughts that I have about the integration process during this crisis. It's really interesting times. We are actually living the Chinese curse. May you live in interesting times. And it has special meanings those days. We all know that the EU has gone through several crises in the last decade and reacted to them, some better, some perhaps less. We are looking actually now at a crisis that I think can be defined as a pluri-crisis in itself. So not only that the EU has gone through the debt crisis, immigration crisis, the Brexit, the rise of populism, we are now in a pluri-crisis where health issue, where the epidemic crisis of the corona is combined together with an economic crisis and with first signs for a spillback of integrations, which I hope can be stopped. I think we are already seeing some putting stop to the spillback, and maybe I would hope with hopefully end with an optimistic note that this crisis would end with a spillover, so advance of the integration process. So I want to speak very briefly about some of those issues, about what Danny started to say about the expectations from the European Union that perhaps are not realistic, and we should not blame the EU for what it is not. And to talk about already the signs of spillovers and spillbacks in the integration process, and eventually about the solidarity of the EU. I guess most of you are so familiar with those maps of where the coronavirus already hit the worst. So this is the state of the European Union as we know it now. It's hit much worse in Italy, Spain, and the western part of Europe, and less, at least for now, at the north and eastern part of Europe. This is Israel. When we're talking about the expectations and competence gap, or expectations capabilities gap with regards to the European Union, this is very much a current theme in EU along all the decades that it has been founded. And we should, I'm not going to go into very details with regards to the competence of the EU, but just to say that there are 4 different kinds of competence by which we should judge the EU on its performance. So the first one is where the EU have exclusive competence, and there, in trade policy, for example, or custom union, then we should judge what the EU is doing because it is the sole institution which has powers to act. Most of the EU powers are shared competence, shared between the EU and member states, and also there, the EU has a lot of chances to operate and to initiate policy and to actually lead policy. But in health policy, as Dan mentioned, the EU don't really have a lot of competence. It can coordinate, it can support, it can advise the countries what to do, but with regards to epidemics, it doesn't really have a lot of competence, as long as I know. It does have a center to monitor the epidemic situation, but I think we should not judge the EU by what it's not and what it doesn't have competence to do. And I agree that it was judged too harshly in the media at the following 2 weeks, at least from what I've been reading, and there was a lot to read. The EU has always been a very convenient scapegoat for the member states to blame for what's going wrong. And I think here, I didn't see so much the use of the EU as a scapegoat, but there is some sort of lack of support in what the EU maybe should have done and didn't do. So the EU is not a national government. It cannot act as a national government. It usually acts quite slowly. It takes time to coordinate the policies between 27 member states. And this is another aspect that doesn't give the EU much advantage in reacting to such severe global crisis on time. But I think we can see in the past week how the EU has risen to the challenge and taken more and more coordinated steps, showing more solidarity also between the member states. So with regards to the expectations, they probably are unrealistic from the EU, and we need to know what competence it has in order to judge its performances. If I'm looking at the chances of spillovers and spillbacks, then we can already see places where the integration to some extent has been troubled. We see different exemptions of Schengen system, for example, in many countries. If I'll just jump for a moment, this is a map that Frontex, an EU agency for border guards, has actually published, where there are numerous suspensions of the free crossing of border, and actually now they are well, you have to check when you cross a border, and that puts a lot of load on the passage of workers, of supply, of goods, and etc. So other than Schengen, there is also a suspension to some extent of competition rules with regards to state aid. And this is obvious. Again, this is also an economic crisis, and we are only beginning to see the engulfment of this economic crisis. We've seen that the European Central Bank has reacted to the fiscal issues and exempted already the Stability and Growth Pact, so countries can go with increase their deficit and their national debt. So I wouldn't necessarily call it a spillback. It's very temporary for the time being, this exemption clauses. We'll have to monitor closely and see how soon the EU can get things back into normal, I would say. I think what worries me most is the solidarity between member states in terms of, you know, reaching out for one another and helping out one another. On the green part here, we see quite, after a few weeks of you know, uncoordinated response, or maybe even no response at all, we do see that the EU reacted quite quickly, I think maybe even quicker than in past crises, and helping supply to go over the border much quicker, helping the workers, 1.5 million workers who are daily passing from one country to another to be able to cross the border much quicker, giving EU citizens outside of Europe chance to come back home and helping one another in that sense. We've seen very quickly research call to have 100 million euros to research to find a vaccination and to find other solutions to the corona crisis, medical solutions, and other technical digital devices to help us cope with this crisis, and other responses like the European Central Bank already willing to give a very generous injection to the economy of 750 billion euros. The Commission also using its budget for other purposes other than intended, so not for the structural funds, but for other purposes. Would we see a spillover, meaning the spillover, would we see an advance of the integration process into further integration that we haven't seen so far? So there already was a discussion about corona bonds, so similar to the Eurobond idea that was during the debt crisis. So far, I understood that Germany and especially the Netherlands are against it. And again, Europe is not united in its answer, but we'll see how the debate goes on. And there could be different other spillovers. It's still too early to judge how the integration process would evolve in here. So I think part of the pluri-crisis situation is, again, that it involves so many issues that has to do with the integration process, the single market, the euro, health issues, and many other things, as Schengen and other things that I've mentioned. I think one last question that I wanted to raise is actually with regards to the rise of populism. I'm not going to go into it and to debate it a lot because we're still in the midst of this crisis, but we see actually quite maybe quiet times in this perspective, and we'll have to see how that actually evolves. I think the last thing is regards European solidarity. The first reaction of the member states was very much nationalized, and still very much nationalized to some extent, but we see more and more acts of solidarity between the member states. And so the national instinct has been thought over, at least in most countries or some countries of the EU, and more European way of thinking is here. So this is very short overview from me, and Emanuele, I'll be happy very much to also hear if there is anything between the EU and Israel in this respect of dealing with the coronavirus crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maya. And Ambassador Giaufret, please, the floor is yours, and we are all here to hear you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. I hope you can hear me well. I would like to thank you and Maya and the Chamber of Commerce, as well as the Association for the Studies of European Integration, for putting together this event. I see a lot of very good friends online, and I'm really happy that you give us this opportunity to discuss this topic, because, as you said at the beginning, we're facing certainly a pandemic, but we're also facing an infodemic, meaning that there's a lot of disinformation that is circulating in the net. We have a task force in Brussels that looks in general to disinformation, and we saw a peak of disinformation regarding coronavirus and the European Union. So this is a great opportunity to discuss some of the issues that are actually there. First of all, as you correctly said, Maya, there's been a number of expectations vis-à-vis the European Union by European citizens. And some of these expectations are actually beyond the competence of the European Union. But I think it's interesting to see that European citizens, in a moment of danger, of grave danger as now, turn certainly to the national government, but also to the European Union. So this means that politically, the European Union has become a very important point of reference for European citizens, and sometimes going well beyond what is possible to do. But we've been able to do many things. And this is important, that we do many things, because we can do many things in the context of this crisis. And this is a very, this is an unprecedented and extremely serious crisis for the world, and certainly for the European Union and for European citizens and member states. So it's important that there's a very strong response from the EU. We take the measures of the challenge we face. It's an international challenge, and we need to address it together. And when I say together, I say certainly within the European Union, but also beyond the European Union. If there's a message that is coming from the coronavirus pandemic 2020, is that member states, nation states alone are very much in great difficulty to address it. These require international cooperation, international solidarity. It requires the mechanism, multilateral mechanism, to address this type of challenges. So I think this is the key message that I think we have to hammer out in every instances, because no one alone will be able to solve this crisis. Now, what the European Union has been doing and going through the various measures, I will try to answer the questions that Maya put, and some of the topics have already been anticipated in Maya's presentation. First of all, I think this crisis tells us that we need a scientific advice. Measures that need to be taken with knowledge of what you're doing, need to respect the proportionality of the measures taken. There's always a balance between public health and socioeconomic impact. This is a multifaceted crisis. First of all, it's a health crisis, and this is the focus now, because we have 1,000 people dying every day in Europe, across the world. But it is a crisis that has huge impact on the socioeconomic situation of the world, and certainly in Europe. So we need to take measures on the basis of knowledge. And we have created in Brussels a panel, an advisory panel with senior epidemiologists that are assisting the Commission to make decisions. And of course, we rely on the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control, which is a scientific body that is there. Now, certainly the first urgency at the moment is in the health sector. And as Maya was suggesting before, the European Union does not have very strong competence in the health sector, which is a national competence. However, there are a number of things that can be done, and we've been doing, particularly in order to allow member states to have the necessary means. Dan, you probably have to mute yourself. We have to make sure that member states have the necessary tools to address the pandemic. We became very quickly all experts on personal protective equipment, masks and other gears, ventilators, testing machines. This is an item that we need to have now in greater supply. So what the Commission has been doing is been working with the industry to work on converting production lines so that we can transfer industry focus on items that are in great need. And secondly, we have launched a number of joint procurement to allow procuring this item at the EU level. 25 member states have agreed, and they're part of this procurement process, which is started at the end of February. So it's quite advanced and very quick, fast-tracked. So we avoid, on one hand, competition between member states, and of course, we're in a better position to negotiate with the industry better prices for the items. So it's a very concrete step that has been done. And we are creating a EU stockpile of medical equipment. This is something we didn't have before. So we are stockpiling equipment so we can then allocate this equipment to the countries that are mostly in need. The other thing that we've done was to allow, a little bit as Israel has done, to allow European citizens to come back to Europe. We had 100,000 European citizens that were stranded abroad with the disruption of international travels. This is a clear national competence, consular competence. But member states have sort of asked the EU to facilitate the coordination of this consular activity. And we've intervened both coordinating on the ground, we've intervening with a partner country to allow flights to land, ensuring landing right for flights. And also we have activated the European civil protection mechanism to pay for those flights. So there's been a number of flights that have been paid up to 75% by the European Union. And this is something new. So we've never seen this type of activity run by the European External Action Service. So this is certainly an example of spillover. When it comes to the single market, certainly member states have adopted a number of measures to protect their own citizens at the beginning of the crisis. You show a map by Frontex with the closures, but this has created a number of problems in order to allow the traffic of goods to continue, the supply chains to go. This was creating blockage, bottlenecks, and even for people to go back home, they were in troubles. So the European Union, the Commission has issued a number of guidelines to this to member states in cooperation with member states. These guidelines have been approved by member states and now they are implemented, and most of these bottlenecks have now been resolved. And without a coordinating body, this wouldn't have happened. The green lane that you mentioned before is precisely to allow the traffic of goods to cross the borders without being interrupted. So the idea is that every truck could be checked, but no more than 15 minutes per truck. So it's very quick. This allows the supply to go on. It's not only an economic issue, but it's also a health issue because medical equipment need to cross borders and be transferred, and also food supply need to continue within the European Union. So it's very critical in the context of the pandemic. Also, we have intervened in the transportation sector on the flights. First of all, by facilitating cargo operations. There's a number of measures, medical health measures taken by member states that can have a very severe impact on cargo transportation. So we introduced guidelines so these measures do not conflict with the possibility of cargo plane to actually move from one country to the other, and so the goods can continue flowing. And then we have allowed airlines to waive a clause that perhaps not everyone knows, but it's a clause called use it or lose it. Use it or lose it, meaning that if you have a slot, you need to use it 80% of the time. Obviously, now planes cannot continue flying empty, so we waive this possibility, so the company continue flying when they can and when it's useful. But let me come now to probably the most important aspect when from the more medium long-term perspective, which is the socioeconomic aspect. The other aspect of the crisis is the fact that our economies are not working anymore because of closures, because of confinement. This is the case in Israel, it's the case in the European Union as well. So we need to preserve our economic assets so that when the crisis, the health crisis subsides, we can reignite, restart the economy. One of the things that the European Commission did, and this is unprecedented, I don't think that people realize how revolutionary this is, but they lift the Stability and Growth Pact. So they activated the escape clause, meaning that now we consider that the economy is in such a shock that member states need to be able to spend money to address the health emergency and the socioeconomic emergency. They remain within the legal framework of the Stability and Growth Pact, but they can spend. And there's no limit to this. It will depend on the duration of the crisis. Probably 2020, almost certainly 2020, we'll see the freedom of spending, if you pass me the expression, and possibly also 2021, depending on the duration of the crisis. But this gives a lot of room of maneuver to member states. The other important initiative is from the European Central Bank, and I think you mentioned it briefly, but they've launched a new program for purchasing bonds worth 750 billion euros. So it's a very, very substantial amount of money, injecting liquidity in the system and allowing member states now to have the necessary liquidity to work. Then the Commission itself has injected 37 billion in the system, either by using cohesion funds that were unspent last year, returning them into the system, or front-loading money that was supposed to be spent at the end of the year or next year. Very, very quickly, 37 billion euros were invested. And this is for member states to put the money where they think it's most necessary. Now, what is really vital in the European Union is the system of small and medium enterprises. Our economic structure is largely based on SMEs. And SMEs are clearly the most vulnerable to the crisis because a big company can, by reducing workforces and moving productions elsewhere, can survive, but the SMEs are actually have much more difficulty to go through the crisis. So it's important that SMEs receive funding now, so they can keep their workforce, they can keep the infrastructure, and they can resume working. So there's been 1 billion euros that's been introduced, has been allocated through the European Investment Fund, managed by the EIB, the European Investment Bank, to leverage about 8 billion euros that should assist about 100,000 SMEs now, so they can actually work on this. And the European Investment Bank is working on an additional 20 billion euros to try to keep the SMEs in particular floating. So these are the measures that we've been taking. You were referring to the Corona bonds before. This is one of the topics that's been discussed during the meeting of the heads of state and government a week ago. It's a very sensitive topic, the mutualization of debt. So this is not a new topic discussed. It was already discussed back during the financial crisis 2008, 2015. It's back on the table. The heads of state and government have given mandate to the Eurogroup to come up with a comprehensive plan to step up European Union engagement from the socioeconomic and financial side. So we will have soon a proposal from the Eurogroup. I don't know whether the Eurobonds or the Corona bonds will be part of this. There are a number of mechanisms that are there. All these mechanisms are on the table, and it's work in progress. Because I think what's very atypical of this crisis is that we don't know exactly the extent of the crisis. We don't know the duration of the crisis. We're learning every day on the implications that the COVID-19 is having on our societies. So it's very much work in progress, and the importance that we continue to react and design responses that are able to address the level of the crisis. Now, one thing again on the economic aspect is the fact that because of the economic problems, we become in a way even more vulnerable to foreign investment. The issue of ensuring that critical European assets and technology remain within the EU is even more vital than used to be yesterday. So there's a reinforced screening mechanism for foreign direct investment so that the crisis does not result in a loss of European assets. Now, if we want to move on, certainly the key aspect is science and research. We will be able to solve the corona crisis only when a vaccine will be available so that we don't fear anymore the effects of the virus, when treatment is available to treat those that are sick. And of course, we need to know more about the virus. So we need to invest quickly on research. So we've activated the Horizon 2020 program, fast-tracking 140 million euros with a number of calls. Israel is certainly participating in this call. You were asking about the cooperation with Israel. This is certainly an area where this is very strong. We work directly with private companies and research institutes in Israel. A call was launched a few weeks ago, and we're expecting soon to have a result. And I'm sure that there's quite a few Israeli entities that are well placed to receive grants on this. So this is a little bit in a nutshell what I can tell in terms of response. Interestingly, at the end of the meeting, the heads of state and government asked the Commission to do two things. One was to design a system of crisis management that is more adapted to address this type of problem. So of course, this is not for now. It's probably tomorrow after the crisis, but certainly one of the result of the crisis will be an attempt to strengthen the EU capacity to respond at the pan-European level. And secondly, in terms of investment and recovery, there's an awareness that we will be able to exit this crisis together. We cannot exit one by one because the virus by nature doesn't allow this type of choices. We are doomed to be together till the very end. Certainly in Europe, but as I said, also outside Europe. So we will have to prepare, the Commission will have to prepare a plan for a coordinated recovery accompanied by investment. Another thing that the Commission is working on, and this is very interesting, it's on a European unemployment reassurance scheme. So to have a scheme at pan-European level to address unemployment. So it's also, I would certainly a spillover because it's a social issue that where the EU was at little competence so far. Let's see what the legislation will produce, but certainly it's an interesting development. Now, last but not least, I'd like to say two words before answering questions, if there are any, on the external dimension of this crisis. Certainly, Europe has been focusing on its own citizens because we are the epicenter of the pandemic. And I can tell you that in Italy, but also in France and in Spain, this crisis is touching the lives of every single family. Nevertheless, we know that there are countries outside Europe that have a much weaker health system. And we need to be able to think what will happen to them as well, because it's right to do so, but also because, as I said, we won't be able to solve the crisis if we're not solving all of us. So we're working with the WHO as well to strengthen health systems of the country that are more under strain or have very weak health system. We've allocated 400 million euros fresh money to help these. And here in Israel, we certainly have been working with the authorities, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the civil administration on how to assist the Palestinian Authority in addressing the challenges of the pandemic. I have to say that certainly one thing that we've seen is that Israel and the Palestinian Authority have been working very well in this specific topic, and we're there to assist them. So that I wanted to touch on this as well, but I hope that I cover everything. My colleague Gosha Kowalczyk, that is listening to the conversation, might step in if things I forgot something. Thank you, Maya.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Gosha, do you want to add something? Is there any point that you would like, or you want to join in the actually in the question and answer?
ישראלי, ישראלי. לך אחר כך, אני לא זוכרת. זאת גושה.
Just a moment, let me find you, Gosha. If you can write me in the chat your identification, so I can identify you. Dan, I think you can maybe help me out and try and help me identify her.
I see her here, but I see on my screen Gosha, but I don't know if you.
Yeah. I've find her.
Okay,
okay.
So unmute her.
Yes.
Okay, Gosha.
Gosha, sorry. Now you can speak.
Now I see I'm unmuting. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you, Dana, and thank you everyone for attending this meeting. I think that Ambassador very well covers the health and economic impact of the crisis. Perhaps two small points is that as we are living in the interdependent world, it's very difficult to keep trade completely separate. So that is why I think it is particularly crucial in these difficult times to keep trade, especially international trade, open with the green lines, with port and freight possibilities open. Traditionally, the European Union and Israel have been very strong trading partners, and since the entry into force of the association agreement that liberalized a two-way bilateral trade, the value of total trade between the EU and Israel increased by more than 50%, and in 2019 it amounted to 35 billion euro altogether. In that regard, I think it is also important to look at ways on how we can prevent unnecessary trade restrictions, especially in these pandemic times. So that is why we are also looking at trade restrictive measures adopted by the European Union's trading partners. And we are encouraging our trading partners to adopt only those that are absolutely necessary to keep the citizens healthy. Also, as a small update, this is not part of the EU's exit strategy yet, but the trade section of the EU delegation to Israel has committed an independent study on increasing investment opportunities between European companies and Israeli companies in three areas, and these are startups and high-tech, agriculture, and technologies mitigating climate change. So I think that that will eventually become part of the strategy, because after the crisis we will need more investment on both sides. So we hope to be able to communicate you with a bit more details. And with this, I would like to conclude, but I would be happy to reply any questions that you might have on details of what was being presented. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. As you can see, I can see already one or two hands that have been raised. But maybe just before that, we have Netta. Do you find Netta Barel?
Yeah, I did.
So maybe
I found Netta, and she's unmuted.
Okay, so maybe we can just ask Netta to give us just a look from Brussels. This is Netta is our commercial attaché of the Ministry of Economy and Industry in Brussels. So maybe Netta, you can give us some highlight from Brussels, please, Netta.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So hello from Brussels. We finally have a little bit of sunshine, which we cannot enjoy because we're all inside. So yes, thank you very much for all the information, both from Maya and from the ambassador from Gosha. I would like to add just a few quick points that we've been dealing here in the past few weeks with a lot of requests from Israeli importers trying to get medical equipment outside of the EU to Israel. And I mean medical equipment such as protective equipment, as there is an EU regulation limiting that export. So we've been trying to assist Israeli importers in bringing such type of equipment into Israel and allowing for them to receive authorization to import those products into Israel. So that's one of the issues that we've been dealing with a lot lately. Also, we've been following, of course, all the EU initiatives and all the regulations that have been coming out, trying to assist both small and medium business enterprises, as the ambassador mentioned. And we're also very much following and distributing to the Israeli industry the information on all the research calls that have been published, because these are major budgets that could be effective to both Israeli companies and Israeli academia. So we are very much giving out all this information. A lot of information can be found on our blog. We update a lot of things on dealing with the corona issues on our blog, and we're very happy to help Israeli exporters and importers in this time in light of the virus. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Netta. So now we'll turn maybe to the question. So I see that Alfred Tovias, you have a question, but let's try to be very short in question to let other people also ask questions. So please, Alfred, the floor is yours. If yes, please. It's okay. You can speak. Alfred, you have to open your mic. You've been unmuted, but we don't hear you. Once again, Maya, try to unmute him.
He is unmuted. I'm sorry, here. I unmuted him again. I don't know. He has to unmute himself, I think. Because I'm,
okay. Oh, okay.
Alfred, yes, please.
No, we don't hear you, Alfred. We have a technical problem with you. Sorry. Alfred, we cannot hear you.
Okay, maybe we can go to Tal Sadeh.
So we go to Tal, okay.
Tal, please.
Tal.
Hi, just two brief points. The first is that I'm not one of those who's despaired by lack of cooperation in the EU. As you mentioned, a lot of it does not reside within the EU anyway. And, you know, in between cities and countries, there's little movement right now. So I think this thing that, this concern that a closure of borders is signaling any problem is not. There are escape clauses. This is a crisis. It does not mean that any law is broken, and as such, it is not a sign of weakening of the EU. My second point is that debts may become a bigger problem. There are a number of countries who have large debts. They arrive at this crisis with a large debt. And after the crisis, when the coronavirus is over and people are back to business, these countries will still have to deal with the debts that they owe, and on top of that, all the corona-related debts. And you know, the number one country to worry about is, of course, Greece. So I wonder if the European Union will be able to have the same spirit during the crisis, also later when dealing with the aftermath. Thank you.
I see Tom Levy has also raised his hand. So Tom, we can go to you. There is someone identified as Tom Levy, and I see a raise of hand. So Tom, if you would like to speak, you're unmuted.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we do.
Okay. Okay. I wanted to talk about the grant of the EU to the refugees lately. The EU has granted a new assistance package of 240 million euros to support Syrian refugees in Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq. And I wanted to ask, is the EU trying to prevent another refugees crisis that will affect Europe? And are there more packages to come to prevent coronavirus spread at the refugee camps?
Okay. Any other question? I'll take the next question to Ambassador. What is the next step that we're going to see from the European? I understand that there's going to be a summit. Maybe you can highlight us when the next summit is going to happen, because I think this is important, at least for us to know what is happening. The other issue is that all the other current affair, and I mean our negotiation on the horizon, I mean, everything has been stalled, or do you think that there is still current affair being operating? Because I know that Israel is in the middle of its negotiation on the Horizon program. So can you tell us if it's continuing, or maybe there is now a kind of halt, and we are waiting for things to calm and then to restart negotiation? And the last question, I understand that like Israel, the EU doesn't have a budget. So I understand that discussion on the EU budget have been also in a way interrupted. So do you see things also being put in a package and moving ahead? And only one remark, maybe I'll keep it for the conclusion, about what's happening here in Israel, but first I ask those questions. So please, Ambassador.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for the questions. I would say that, first of all, we do have a budget, contrary to Israel, which are working on budget of next year, from 2021. So until December, we still have a budget. But certainly, and this is also to respond to the question of Tal today, one of the other lessons that we should take from this crisis is that we need a strong European budget. Member states were in the middle of a discussion on the next financial perspective, so the budget from 2021 to 2027, and it was a difficult discussion. It will certainly remain a difficult discussion, but what we've seen today is the added value of the European Union transcend the values of the money that is put in the coffers. And hopefully these will be the lessons that will be taken by member states. We have, for the moment, the focus is on the crisis management. So certainly there will be a delay in the discussions. The issue of the current affair issue have been set a little bit aside, but I think they will resume pretty quickly. The next European Council, I think, is scheduled in about 10 days. I think this is another interesting aspect of the crisis on the EU decision-making process, how quickly we adapted to this system. There were a number of cases within the EU institutions in key positions very quickly early in the process. So we had to move to our video meetings very quickly. And I think what we learned that we are able to manage these quite well and take decisions. So I'm sure that the discussion will resume very quickly. There will be delay probably also in the Horizon 2020 in the process of association, because Horizon 2020 will be, Horizon Europe will be delayed because the budget will be delayed. So there will be a sort of a domino effect. But I don't think this will be a very substantial delay. But hopefully we'll have this new budget for 2021, 2027 agreed and properly agreed. Tal has raised a very important issue, which is the sustainability of debts of a number of member states and how this will be managed. Certainly Greece is one case, but it's not only Greece. There are other countries, Italy, Spain, that are suffering very much at the moment. And I think clearly this will depend on how quickly the economy can bounce back. This will be the critical element. And we have to see whether we will continue to look at our society and economy. And this I'm speaking really more as European citizens, we'll continue to look at our economy the same way we've done before the crisis. What will be the long-term impact of this crisis? We are able to continue operating in this situation. I have to tell everyone that yesterday, or the day before yesterday, the European Council, the Foreign Affairs Council, decided on deploying a military operation off the coast of Libya. It's a satellite, air and naval operation to enforce the embargo on Libya. This has been ongoing for a while. The discussion has been ongoing for a while, and just 2 days ago, there was a breakthrough, and we adopted it. So even in the situation of crisis in foreign relations, we are able to make decisions. And the issue of refugees that was referred to by Tom, I think. Yes, we will continue supporting refugees. There's a new conference foreseen in Brussels in April on the Syrian crisis and its ramification in the neighboring countries, so Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and Turkey, of course. And I have no doubt that one of the focus will be on the effects of the COVID-19 on these refugee camps. These are very vulnerable populations. So it's a question of their rights, but it's also a question of public health for those countries, that if we don't control the expansion of the virus in these refugee camps, there will be a rebound of the pandemic. So now, as I said at the beginning, I think this is an important aspect. We have to focus on within Europe, because the crisis is in Europe, but we cannot forget about our partner countries, and the refugees in those countries are there. I have to say that the refugee pressures has gone down very, very substantially. We had the crisis again that was going up, particularly at the Greek-Turkish border just a few weeks ago. This has gone down, so it's no longer an emergency we're facing, but we know that the problem is still there. It's not going to be solved, so we need to work on that.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, maybe we can use the fact that we have Ronnie Benetov from Italy, and I think that he's talking to us from Italy, or he's connected to Italy. Maybe Ronnie, you can tell us something about your daily life there in Italy. Ronnie, are you online? Do you hear me?
Yes, I'm going to unmute you.
Yes. Hi. Well, I'm not in Italy. I'm now in Tel Aviv.
Ah, okay.
But I follow very closely what's going on in Italy. Luckily, in the last, let's say, 4 or 5 days, we can see the graphic line of the contagious increase, that it's flattening a little bit. I left Italy, I think it was on the 6th of March. We were around 23% increase per day. Now we are around 4% increase per day, so still a few thousand people, but it's a dramatic decrease. And if we look a little bit inside Italy at the different regions, Lombardy, which was the region where we had the highest number of sick people and the contagion was highest, is even much below the 4%. I think yesterday was 1.5 or 2%. And for the first time, at the end of the day, after 24 hours, there were less people treated in intensive care in Lombardy hospitals. There were 7 people less than the day before. So I think it is a sign, and it is a sign that the measures that are taken are not functioning. Now, what it is, everybody started thinking now about what will happen after, the day after. And I must say that today there is a big deception, even from parties or part of the population that were very far from the populistic approach of several parties in Italy, but you see many people that are quite deceived by the European answer, the EU answer to the crisis in Italy. Italy is probably the country where the crisis started first. Now several countries are seeing that it's happening also to them, but the economical crisis in Italy started before, let's say, due to the coronavirus, started before, a couple of weeks before the others, and the economical situation in Italy is dramatic. And I would say that most of the people expected a stronger reaction from the European side, and we still hope we will see something more dramatic that we were speaking before. The ambassador spoke before about, I think, 37 billion that have been put, or I would like to remind that in the United States, 2 trillions has been allocated. So we see that we speak about different level of amounts, by orders of magnitude, and probably what European countries will need after this crisis, it's something of a different order of magnitude. Another issue that is very much worrying Italy today is the coordination in the handling of the day after. Let's say when one country will start having less people ill, that contagions will go down. The danger will be bringing it back from other countries that are 3 weeks behind. So I think in that area, a very strong coordination from EU will be needed, and I'm sure they are already dealing with that. It will be something not very easy to handle, but it's a very important issue. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think that we are.
We have, Danny, we have two more people who.
No problem. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So we'll first try with Nimrod Goren, and then Alfred, we will try to go back to you and see if your microphone works. And just a moment. Nimrod, you should try and unmute yourself. Could you try? Yes, I think you should try. Yes, please. We can
Thank
hear
you. I would like to ask you, Ambassador, about what is happening in Hungary these last few days in response to the crisis, the legislation that is taking place over there, and what ways does the EU have to ensure that the crisis is not manipulated by leaders to undermine democratic values, but rather that ways are being found in Europe and in other countries to leverage democracy and strengthen it following the current crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. I will add a few more questions that I received by WhatsApp. Emanuele, a person has been asking, what are your thoughts about the future of the European Union after the crisis? We heard you speaking about it, but if you could, state your opinion about that. We heard from different leaders in the past few weeks that they are afraid that the future of the European Union is at stake. I think this is sort of news of last week and not so much this week, but still, if you could add your opinion about that. And we did hear recently about negative buzz about the lack of solidarity. Is it coming from Russia? We did hear today about bots in Twitter coming from China to Italy, how China is helping Italy and the EU maybe less. So if you can comment on that, please. And now I think we'll collect the last question from Alfred, and then, okay, we'll close. Okay, Alfred, I'm trying to, yes, you are unmuted now. Can you try and talk?
No.
Alfred?
No, he has a problem. It's a problem with Alfred itself. It's not.
Okay, so Alfred, we cannot hear you. I've unmuted you, but we cannot hear you. So, Ambassador Giaufret, would you like to comment on the last questions?
Thank you. No, let me first to say that when we compare the 37 billion package of the European Commission and the American package, of course, there's a difference. but the EU is not a state. So these 37 million are complementing national measures. We saw that member states, Germany, Italy, but everyone is taking their own national measures. And they can do this because the escape clauses allow them to spend, particularly those that were had fiscal problems. So in order to make a comparison, you need to bring together these packages with the EU one, and then you can compare with the American one. But we cannot compare the one of the Commission with the one of the US.
Emanuele, I have seen numbers that the EU member states in total have actually allocated 4 trillion euros altogether.
It's about that, yes. It's a very impressive and I think larger than the American package if you put them together.
If we put,
But again, I think it's important to say that we don't know what the effect of this crisis are. We don't know what has been done so far is enough. The Commission will provide a forecast in May on the growth in Europe, so we probably have a better idea then. But certainly, it's everything is in motion at the moment. It's difficult to make any final assessment. What's the future of the European Union? Lack of solidarity, the Hungarian emergency law. Well, let me say, first of all, that there are a number of member states that have taken emergency steps because of the crisis. It's totally legitimate to take emergency and extraordinary measures in such a moment. The question is that these measures cannot be taken against fundamental values of the European Union. There's a balance there that has to be made, and the President of the European Commission, Ms. von der Leyen, and the Commissioner for Rule of Law and Justice, Didier Reynders, have made very clear that we cannot address the crisis by reducing fundamental freedoms and turning our back to the European values. So the Commission has a responsibility to assess these programs, and it will be done, including for the Hungarian one. So there's certainly a monitoring ongoing. The European Union is facing certainly a big test, and it's a test that everyone is now facing, because I agree with the colleagues that were speaking with from the Italian angle. There are expectations, and there's a disappointment among certain people. So it's important that we raise to the occasion and we respond to the demands of the citizens. The citizens need to be really made at the center of the action, and this will make the difference. Solidarity among member states is really an intra-European issue, how member states are responding to each other. We did see a number of initiatives taken recently. Germany is taking patients from France, from Italy. We've seen Polish doctors going to Italy. We've seen the Czechs sending respirators to Spain, and the Austrians sending equipment to Italy. So there is things going on. Europe, when the crisis was in China at the beginning, back in January, February, Europe sent 56 tons of material to China to assist them in overcoming the crisis. And I think if the Chinese now are responding and sending material, I think it's very much welcome. We need to work in solidarity. It's not the moment to blame each other, because the blame game has never healed one single patient.
Well, thank you very much. I think that we have exhausted the time, but I think that first of all, I want to thank again the ambassador and Gosia and Netta and obviously Maya for helping organizing this first of meeting, because we are going to continue. I think that first of all, we are listening to one another, which is not usually the case in Israel, that you all speak together, but with this system, we have to listen to one another. So it's a good way of communicating. But I think that definitely we are going to try and to have additional type of meeting, maybe with specific topics, and even inviting guests from Brussels. I spoke to Gosia today that maybe we can find experts from the Commission, and I'm sure that Netta also will be happy to try to supply.
Danny, we cannot hear you so well. Can you repeat your last sentence that you started with Netta?
to have this type of meeting in the future. Let me just finish by first of all saying Chag Sameach to everybody for Pesach, so we want them another occasion to meet. The chamber, the UA chamber is continued to function. We have just relaunched our website, our LinkedIn, our Instagram. We have both Tali here is a stagiaire that is if you look at her, she's working very hard to put a new material on the website of the chamber, and also Ella is taking care of all the bureaucracy of the chamber. So we are definitely back in town to try to be active and to supply information and help you. And again, I think that for Israel at least, and just to one more remark, the trade and the ports and the airports in Israel are totally open. The trade is continuing. There is no disruption in terms of the logistic. Obviously, there is less plane going out, so there is less capacity for air cargo, but the ports are functioning. And as far as we know, the same is happening in Europe. So there is also opening of the ports in Europe, and the circulation is taking place. And we at the private sector is trying as much as we can to push the government to make us function as much as we can, even in the time of crisis. Just to let you know that all export companies that at least export 25% of their product have been recognized by the Israeli authority as essential bodies or essential factories, so they can continue to function without the restriction of going down to 30% of the personnel. And we have a special, business continuity protocol that we negotiated with the Ministry of Health that enable companies to continue and function under the circumstances. And if we want, we'll circulate this protocol. I've sent it both to the EU people and to the chamber, and Yoram Eldar, who is here representing the bilateral association of Chamber of Commerce, is also doing an excellent job by disseminating information. So information is very important, and we'll continue to send information and to get those types of meetings. Maya, you have the final word because you are the host.
Danny, I want to thank you, and Ambassador Giuffre, I want to thank you as well. I wish you all a happy Passover and good health in those times. And we hope to get maybe together after Passover and have more optimistic views on the world and on the European Union. Thank you very much for participating and bearing with me for my technical familiarities with Zoom. Okay. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Chag Sameach.
We finished.
Chag Sameach, Emanuele.